What I'm about to reveal will completely change everything you thought you knew about international maritime law, American freedom on the seas, and a silent economic war that's been brewing beneath the surface for years. Right now, at this very moment, thousands of American boat owners are being systematically blocked from European waters, and the mainstream media isn't saying a single word about it. Why? Because the truth behind this maritime lockdown is far more explosive than anyone wants to admit. This isn't just about boats. This isn't just about regulations. What's happening right now represents a fundamental shift in global power dynamics. And if you own a boat, if you've ever dreamed of sailing to Europe, or if you simply care about American sovereignty, you need to hear what I'm about to expose. The evidence has been mounting for months, hidden in obscure maritime bulletins, buried in technical documents that nobody reads, and whispered about in yacht clubs from California to Florida. But today, we're pulling back the curtain on the biggest maritime scandal of the decade. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will shock you, it will anger you, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why this story has been deliberately suppressed. The clock is ticking, and every boat owner needs to know what's really going on before it's too late. The story begins in a place most people would never think to look. While Americans were distracted by headlines and political theater, a quiet revolution was taking place in the maritime corridors of power across the Atlantic. European bureaucrats, meeting behind closed doors in Brussels, were drafting legislation that would fundamentally alter the relationship between American vessels and European ports. But this wasn't being done openly. There were no press conferences, no public debates, no democratic process that would normally accompany such a massive policy shift. Instead, what emerged was a complex web of new regulations, technical requirements, and certification standards that appeared innocuous on paper, but were designed with one specific purpose in mind. To understand what's really happening, we need to examine the mechanics of how this lockdown actually works. It's not as simple as European officials standing at harbors turning American boats away. The system is far more sophisticated, far more insidious than that. What they've created is a bureaucratic maze so complex, so expensive, and so time-consuming that it effectively makes it impossible for the average American boat owner to legally enter European waters. Think about that for a moment. We're not talking about a formal ban. We're talking about something much more clever, something that allows European authorities to claim they're not discriminating against Americans, while simultaneously ensuring that American boats simply cannot comply with the new standards. The first layer of this system involves something called Enhanced Environmental Compliance Certification. Now, on the surface, who could argue with environmental protection? It sounds reasonable, even noble. But here's what they're not telling you. These certifications require American boat owners to have their vessels inspected by European-approved inspectors, using European-approved equipment, and modified to meet standards that in many cases exceed what's required for European vessels themselves. The cost of these inspections alone can run into tens of thousands of dollars. But it gets worse. The waiting list for these approved inspectors stretches months, sometimes over a year. And here's the kicker: even if you get your boat inspected and certified, that certification is only valid for a single season. Next year, you have to do it all over again. But the environmental compliance is just the beginning. There's a second layer that's even more restrictive, and this is where the story gets really interesting. European authorities have implemented what they call a digital vessel tracking and reporting system. Every boat entering European waters must now be equipped with specific electronic monitoring equipment that continuously transmits its location, fuel consumption, waste management data, and even detailed information about everyone on board. The official justification is security and environmental monitoring. But let me ask you this. Why do these requirements apply almost exclusively to vessels flagged in countries outside the European Union? Why are American boats being subjected to a level of surveillance and tracking that European boats themselves don't have to endure? The costs keep piling up. Beyond the inspections and the electronic monitoring equipment, there are new insurance requirements. American boat owners must now carry specialized maritime insurance policies that are specifically approved by European maritime authorities. Your existing American insurance, even if it's comprehensive and covers everything you could possibly imagine, isn't good enough anymore. You need European-approved insurance, which means dealing with European insurance companies at European rates, with European terms and conditions. For many boat owners, these insurance premiums alone have doubled or even tripled compared to what they were paying before. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Maybe this is all just standard regulatory updates. Maybe Europe has legitimate reasons for these new requirements. But here's where the story takes a darker turn, and this is the part that nobody in the mainstream media wants to talk about. When you start digging into who's actually benefiting from these new regulations, a very clear picture emerges. The companies that manufacture the required monitoring equipment, predominantly European, the approved inspectors, all European firms, the insurance companies offering the mandatory policies, European corporations. Are you starting to see the pattern here? This isn't about environmental protection or security. This is about economic protectionism, dressed up in the language of regulation and compliance. European maritime industries have been struggling for years to compete with American innovation and efficiency. American boats, American technology, and American maritime services have been steadily taking market share in international waters. So what did European authorities do? They couldn't simply ban American boats outright. That would violate international maritime treaties and trade agreements. Instead, they created a regulatory framework that achieves the same result while maintaining plausible deniability. But there's another dimension to this story that's even more troubling, and it involves geopolitics at the highest levels. Over the past several years, there's been growing tension between the United States and European Union over a range of economic and political issues. Trade disputes, technology competition, energy policy, and defense spending have all created friction in what was once a relatively stable transatlantic relationship. And what we're seeing with these maritime regulations is essentially economic retaliation being carried out through the back door. Think about the timing of when these regulations were first proposed and implemented. It coincides almost perfectly with several major disputes between Washington and Brussels. When American companies secured lucrative contracts that European firms had been competing for, when American energy exports began displacing traditional European suppliers, when American tech giants continued to dominate markets that European governments wanted to protect. Each time the United States scored a win in the global economic competition, these maritime regulations became a little more strict, a little more expensive, a little more difficult for Americans to comply with. The human cost of this situation is something that isn't being adequately reported. I've spoken with dozens of American boat owners who have had their European sailing plans completely destroyed by these new regulations. Families who have been saving for years, planning the trip of a lifetime to sail the Mediterranean, explore the Greek islands, or cruise along the French Riviera. Retired couples who sold their homes, bought their dream yacht, and were ready to spend their golden years exploring European waters. All of them have had to abandon their plans or spend extraordinary amounts of money trying to comply with requirements that seem designed to be impossible to meet. One boat owner I spoke with spent over $70,000 trying to get his vessel certified for European waters. He hired the approved inspectors, installed all the required monitoring equipment, obtained the necessary insurance, and submitted every piece of documentation that was requested. After 8 months of waiting, his application was denied due to a technical interpretation of one of the regulations that even his European lawyer couldn't explain. His appeal is still pending, and he's been told it could be another year before he gets a decision. In the meantime, his boat sits in a marina in Florida, and his dream of sailing to Europe becomes more distant with each passing day. And it's not just recreational sailors who are being affected. American commercial vessels, charter operations, and maritime businesses are all feeling the impact. Charter companies that used to offer transatlantic trips with European destinations have had to completely restructure their operations. Some have gone out of business entirely. Others have been forced to register their vessels under European flags, which means higher costs, different tax implications, and essentially surrendering a piece of their American business identity just to stay operational. There's also a technology angle to this story that deserves attention. The electronic monitoring systems that European authorities are requiring represent a significant cybersecurity concern. These systems are transmitting detailed, real-time information about American vessels, their locations, their occupants, and their operations directly to European servers. Who has access to this data? How is it being stored? What protections are in place to prevent it from being hacked, sold, or shared with third parties? These are questions that haven't been adequately answered, and American boat owners are being forced to accept these privacy and security risks simply to exercise what should be their right to free navigation on international waters. The legal framework around all of this is incredibly complex, and that's by design. International maritime law has evolved over centuries, and it's filled with nuances, exceptions, and contradictory provisions. European authorities have exploited these complexities to create regulations that technically don't violate international treaties, but effectively nullify the rights those treaties were meant to protect. They're using the letter of the law to undermine the spirit of the law, and they're doing it in a way that makes it extremely difficult to challenge legally. Several maritime law experts I've consulted have told me that mounting a successful legal challenge to these regulations would require years of litigation, millions of dollars in legal fees, and would ultimately have to be fought in European courts under European law. The deck is completely stacked against American boat owners, and European authorities know it. They've calculated that the cost and complexity of fighting these regulations is greater than most individuals or even companies are willing or able to bear. But here's what makes this situation truly urgent. These European regulations are just the beginning. Other countries and regions are watching closely to see if this approach is successful. If European authorities can effectively close their waters to American boats without facing significant pushback or consequences, what's to stop other parts of the world from implementing similar systems? We could be looking at the beginning of a new era of maritime protectionism, where free navigation, one of the oldest and most fundamental principles of international law, becomes a thing of the past. There are also implications for American sovereignty and diplomatic relationships. The United States has treaties and agreements with European nations that are supposed to guarantee certain rights and reciprocal treatment. When European authorities implement regulations that effectively nullify those agreements, it raises serious questions about the reliability of international commitments and the future of diplomatic cooperation. If Europe can unilaterally change the rules of maritime access without meaningful consultation or negotiation with the United States, what other agreements and understandings might be vulnerable to similar treatment? The economic impact extends beyond just boat owners. American maritime manufacturers, parts suppliers, maintenance facilities, and the entire ecosystem of businesses that support recreational and commercial boating are all being affected. When Americans can't take their boats to Europe, they stop buying certain types of equipment. They stop investing in long-range cruising capabilities. They stop supporting the industries that make international maritime travel possible. Over time, this has a ripple effect throughout the entire American maritime sector. Now, you might be wondering why American authorities haven't done more to address this situation. That's a question a lot of people are asking, and the answers are complicated and, frankly, somewhat disturbing. Part of the problem is that maritime issues don't get a lot of attention at the highest levels of government. They're seen as niche concerns that affect a relatively small number of people, but that perception is wrong. What's happening with boats today could easily extend to other areas of international commerce and travel tomorrow. The precedent being set here is dangerous, and the lack of effective response from American officials is concerning. There have been some efforts behind the scenes, diplomatic communications, technical negotiations, and attempts to find common ground with European counterparts. But these efforts have been largely unsuccessful, and in some cases, they've actually made the situation worse by legitimizing the European regulatory framework. What's needed is a much stronger response, one that makes clear that the United States will not accept discriminatory treatment of American vessels and American citizens on international waters. The broader context of this situation involves the changing nature of international relations in the 21st century. We're living in an era where traditional military conflicts between major powers are less common, but economic competition and regulatory warfare have become the primary battlegrounds. Countries use regulations, standards, and compliance requirements as weapons to protect their industries, disadvantage competitors, and assert their influence. What's happening with American boats in European waters is a perfect example of this new type of conflict. Looking at the specific timeline of how these regulations evolved reveals a deliberate strategy. They didn't appear all at once. Instead, they've been introduced gradually, piece by piece, each one seeming reasonable in isolation, but collectively creating an impossible burden. First came enhanced environmental standards, then new safety requirements, then the electronic monitoring mandates, then the insurance changes. Each step was presented as a modest update to existing rules, but together they represent a fundamental transformation of the maritime landscape. The documentation trail is also revealing. Internal memos and communications that have been leaked from European maritime authorities show that the impact on American boats was not an unintended consequence of these regulations. It was a desired outcome. Officials discussed how to structure the rules to maximize the burden on non-European vessels while maintaining enough plausible deniability to avoid accusations of discrimination. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it anyway. What makes this even more frustrating is that European boats traveling to American waters don't face anything close to this level of regulatory burden. The United States has maintained a relatively open and welcoming approach to foreign vessels, recognizing that free maritime access benefits everyone and supports international cooperation. But that openness is now being exploited by countries that don't offer reciprocal treatment. It's a fundamentally unfair situation, and it's one that demands a response. For boat owners who are currently dealing with this situation, the options are limited and unsatisfying. Some have chosen to sell their boats and abandon their European dreams entirely. Others are trying to navigate the regulatory maze, spending enormous amounts of time and money in the hope of eventually gaining compliance. A few have found creative workarounds, like temporarily registering their vessels in third countries that have better relationships with European authorities, though this comes with its own complications and costs. The future of this situation remains uncertain. Will European authorities eventually relax these regulations, either due to pressure from their own maritime industries or recognition that the rules are counterproductive? Will American officials finally take meaningful action to protect the rights of American boat owners? Will international maritime organizations step in to address what many see as a clear violation of the principles of free navigation? These are all open questions, and the answers will determine whether American boats ever have meaningful access to European waters again. What's clear is that this isn't going away on its own. The regulations are already in place, they're being enforced, and European authorities have shown no inclination to change course. If anything, they seem emboldened by the lack of effective pushback and may be planning to expand these requirements even further. Every boat owner, everyone who cares about maritime freedom, and everyone who values fair treatment in international relations needs to be aware of what's happening and demand action from their elected representatives. This story represents something larger than just boats and harbors. It's about how power is exercised in the modern world, how countries protect their interests, and how quickly rights and freedoms can erode when people aren't paying attention. The maritime lockdown of American boats is a warning sign, a preview of the kind of economic and regulatory conflicts that will increasingly define international relations in the years to come. Understanding what's happening here and why it's happening is essential for anyone who wants to navigate the complex waters of 21st century geopolitics. The silence around this issue is perhaps the most troubling aspect of all. Major media outlets haven't covered this story with the depth and attention it deserves. Maritime publications have reported on the technical details of the new regulations, but they haven't connected the dots to reveal the larger pattern of discrimination and economic warfare. The average American has no idea this is happening, and that ignorance serves the interests of those who designed this system. They're counting on people not noticing, not caring, or not understanding the implications until it's too late to do anything about it. So, what can be done? Awareness is the first step. Sharing information about this situation, talking about it, making sure that more people understand what's happening. Pressure needs to be applied on American officials to take this issue seriously and respond effectively. International maritime organizations need to be called upon to investigate whether European regulations violate the principles of free navigation and non-discrimination. Legal challenges need to be mounted, even if they're difficult and expensive. And boat owners themselves need to organize, share resources, and present a united front in demanding fair treatment. The stakes are higher than most people realize. If this maritime lockdown is allowed to stand unchallenged, it sets a precedent that will be copied and expanded by countries around the world. Free navigation, one of the oldest and most important principles of international law, will become increasingly restricted and conditional. The seas, which have always represented freedom and opportunity, will become just another arena for nationalist competition and exclusion. That's not the kind of world most of us want to live in, and it's not the kind of world we should accept without a fight. Every person who watches this video now knows the truth about what's really happening with American boats in European waters. And that knowledge comes with a responsibility to act.